Hello, my friends across the fruited and rooted plain. It's time for the Gardening Simplified Show with Stacey Hirvela, me, Rick Vuyst, and our engineer and producer, Adriana Robinson, coming to you from the beautiful Studio A here at Proven Winners ColorChoice Shrubs. Okay, Stacey, it's Thanksgiving time to eat.
Yay!
I was reflecting on the writing of Michael Pollan and his famous quote, "Eat food, not too much, mostly plants." And I say, grow more plants to eat, especially if kids are around. Grow them in containers if you have to grow them in containers. I like vegetables. Maybe it's because I worked on a muck farm as a kid.
A muck farm?
A muck farm.
What's a muck farm?
A muck farm is black, peaty type dirt where we planted and pulled onions, dill, radishes. To this day, I love radish.
And celery.
And celery.
That big celery growing area anytime you got the muck.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the essential aromatic oils that accumulate in plant leaves, and it produces the flavors of vegetables. Think of basil or oregano also as herbs. Of course, radishes, carrots, bell peppers, cucumbers, snap peas, celery. They're more delicious to eat raw. I do not like cooked cauliflower, by the way.
I don't really like it rare, but you know what? I can always eat it roasted. Roasted cauliflower is pretty great.
And then, of course, potatoes or beets, they're better cooked than eating them raw.
I make a raw beet salad, but it's shredded. No one's like biting into a beet like an apple or anything.
My favorites, oddly enough, are green peppers and celery. And I'll share with you the story, the Battle of Burencool. The Battle of Burencool was between me and my parents. My parents were into kale before it was cool to be into kale. And the Dutch have this very peculiar way of making food. At night, we would have boerenkool, or now they call it stomp pot. And essentially what they do is they cook kale and mix it with potatoes. As a kid, I revolted. There was no way that I was going to eat that. And like I said, my parents were Dutch, and the Dutch have this peculiar thing where you eat boerenkool or stomp pot for dinner, and then you eat chocolate for breakfast.
Oh.
We would get something called hagelslag, which is just like sprinkles all over toast. So, it was strange. But the point here is that it's biologically proven that as we get older, our taste buds evolve and decrease in number. I guess what I'm saying is I'm papa to a grandson, Max, who just voraciously eats vegetables. Peppers, you name it, kiwi, beans, green zebra tomatoes, just gnaw on a cucumber. It's amazing to watch. But for most kids, the bitter taste of vegetables, they kind of revolt against them until you become an adult.
It's true. Kids can be very polarized on vegetables. But, I do think that things are improving since the time that you or I were kids. Back then, everybody cooked vegetables to within an inch of their life, right? Everything was just boiled and, terrible or just canned. And nowadays, I think, people are so much more educated about cooking vegetables in a way that makes them taste good, makes them nutritious. You can get pretty much any vegetable any day of the year fresh. And so, yes, kids are always going to be more sensitive to bitter flavors and that kind of thing. I think that the future is brighter for kids and vegetables than it ever was in the past.
I think so, too. And I think we have to remember that kids operate based on instinct. It's just like the deer browsing through your landscape, okay? And if it's bitter, it almost tastes as though it's kind of toxic. And so they have to build up this taste through repeated exposure. But getting there, I guess, is a little bit tough. And then in addition to that, I have found that kids associate sweets, cake, ice cream, etc., with good times.
Yeah, that's
right?
True. Yeah.
And so you've got all that battling against you, but you can make vegetables make vegetables more tasty for kids to get them to eat it. I think kids sometimes view junk food as a reward and vegetables as a chore.
Most likely, yeah.
Trying to break that cycle it can be difficult. Let me give you a limerick that I wrote on this subject. There was a young man straightened out when told to eat veggies would pout. With many appeals, he would force down his meals, and soon he began to sprout. Now old, he still likes his sweets. Yeah, I'm talking about myself. Succumbs to temptations with treats. Sugar plums dance in his head. He now eats vegetables instead, resigned to chewing on raw beets. Time in life changed his station. Veggies no longer cause agitation. I thought there was a place called kohlrabi. Now I slice it and dip it in wasabi. I just need a vegucation.
Aw.
Well, it's just important. And the other thing that I wanted to point out and that I have found with kids is that if they're surrounded by gardeners or surrounded by a vegetable garden from a young age, they tend to appreciate vegetables.
Yeah, I think it makes a huge difference to actually see the vegetables growing and to think of them less as something off a shelf and something that is actually growing.
Exactly.
And, a red tomato in a plastic container is one thing, but a beautiful ripe tomato on a vine on a beautiful summer day is quite another. And as kids get more curious about that kind of thing, then, it kind of opens up their world.
Yeah, and that's what I've found. If Max can go into the garden and pick a pepper or a cucumber, bring it inside and wash it, he enjoys eating it. And
it's a great feeling.
I really do think it makes
That's a feeling you never outgrow, whether you're 4 years old or much older.
So cook to try to reduce bitterness. I know when I discovered maple syrup on Brussels sprouts, it changed my life. It really did. Put veggies on pizza, for example, dips, and then repetition. I mean, think of us as adults, coffee or beer or dark chocolate. There was repetition involved to acquire a taste, and I think the same applies to kids.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite vegetable to eat?
I could probably be better off telling you the vegetables I don't like to eat than the vegetables I do like to eat. Because I do, I grew up, my dad owned a produce store. And was very passionate about fresh produce. So even though I grew up in the 70s and 80s, we had fresh vegetables. We never had canned or frozen vegetables in the house ever. We always had fresh vegetables. And he was a fan of cooking them minimally. So we always had like really good, high quality vegetables ever since I was a kid. And so I've actually always really liked vegetables. Cauliflower, I've been a little on the fence on. That's probably one that's not my absolute favorite. Although I do like it, a good Indian potato and cauliflower dish, it's hard to beat. And like I said, I do like to roast it. But I don't really love cooked green peppers.
Really?
I love them raw.
I like green peppers any way I can get.
Yeah, when you said you like green peppers and celery, those are two of the most polarizing vegetables, and they're like your two favorites.
Well, actually, my favorite, if push came to shovel, and I had to tell you what my favorite is, especially during the holidays and Thanksgiving, it would be green bean casserole.
Oh, well, that's a fair bit more than a vegetable. But you got mushrooms in there, some onions.
There's
that's
vegetables
good.
In there. It counts.
Yeah.
Green bean casserole. I mean, talk about taste buds. By the way, another thing for people who have me on their Christmas list, for me, the wasabi and soy sauce almonds.
Oh.
As a snack. Have you had those?
I have not had those, but I am a big fan of the wasabi peas.
Oh yeah.
Those are delicious.
Yeah, that's great stuff. Great stuff. And I was thinking also about deep fried maple leaves. So in Minoa City, Japan, they use a tempura butter coating on these maple leaves. So it's flour, egg yolks, and cold water. And they deep fry them. And wow, I guess it's supposed to be absolutely delicious. So I would love to add that to the menu for Thanksgiving.
Oh, are you going to try it?
I might.
Okay. Really freak out your guests this year.
Well, I'm hungry, so let's take a break. And then after the break, we are going to move to Plants on Trial and see what Stacey has on her mind today here on the Gardening Simplified Show. Stay tuned.
Greetings, gardening friends, and welcome back to the Gardening Simplified Show. You know, we ended the last segment. You were talking, Rick, about deep fried maple leaves, which is something that they make in Japan. And the Japanese word for maple is momiji. And I happen to have a friend who is Japanese, and I was visiting Japan with her in fall. And so we were talking about maple leaves. And of course, Japanese maples are understandably everywhere in Japan, and they have that very distinctive 5-lobed leaf. And so as a kid in Japan, you give your friend a momiji, like you smack him on the back, and if it leaves a handprint, you gave him a momiji, a maple leaf.
Oh, excellent.
So
I'm going to make sure to explain that first before I do it to someone.
you might want to do that while you serve them your deep fried maple leaves to make up for it. So there's a little fun fact to get us started. So today it's time for Plants on Trial. We're going to talk about one of the 325 plus proven winners, ColorChoice shrubs. You know, I always have fun trying to relate it to the topic. And of course, today's topic, being just before Thanksgiving, is vegetables, and it is not a vegetable. So I'll say that right off the bat. This is not a plant that you're going to eat. We do have some edible plants in the Proven Winners ColorChoice line. Most of these are not really going to be on the market abundantly until next year at the earliest. For example, we have a beautiful, fabulous, amazing new blackberry, which would not be ready now. It's a summer fruit, but called Taste of Heaven. That's really interesting, and we'll certainly be talking about that in the future on the show. But I couldn't tie it into the edibles, but I did tie it in to today's show in two ways. The plant on trial is Arctic Fire Yellow Dogwood. And the two reasons we're covering it today, number one, is because it's a plant that I am extremely grateful for, and in the spirit of Thanksgiving. And two, it's going to look amazing on your holiday table as a decoration. You won't be eating it. No one will be gnawing the twigs. Not toxic if they do, but we don't recommend it. But it's a great plant for holiday decor. Now, it is a selection of our native red twig dogwood. So the red twig dogwood is, you know, if you live anywhere pretty much in most of the eastern U.S., say north of about North Carolina, red twig dogwood is one of the most ubiquitous roadside plants that I can think of. I mean,
clipped some yesterday.
It grows everywhere.
And I was looking at a grove of them outside my mom's window thinking, I need to prune those. I'd like those for Christmas.
Well, we're going to get into some pruning tips. So yes, they are a plant that does benefit from pruning for sure. But they're really ubiquitous. And even though you might not notice them for the most part of the year, by the time the foliage starts dropping in autumn, they are very noticeable. And that's because the red color, it's called a red twig dogwood, the red color on their stems doesn't really develop until it gets cold out and you really see it. Now, it's very similar with Arctic Fire Yellow, which sounds funny because it is a red twig dogwood, but it's a yellow red twig dogwood. So it's a yellow twig dogwood, but then people might not know what you're talking about it. But it is a Cornus sericea. I know this is very confusing. Cornus sericea, our native, beautiful red osier dogwood, some people also call it. And similarly, you know, it doesn't really look like much until about October. The foliage starts to drop, it gets colder, and then the stems just turn this amazing bright yellow color.
I noticed that in the garden center in pots. Those stems bring sunshine to your life. I mean, they got so bright this October.
They are really, really bright. And I think, you know, as ubiquitous and wonderful and reliable as red twig dogwood is, it's really nice to have something that's a little bit different than red twig. You know, the red is great, but one of the things about the red, you know, it can look a little bit dark in the landscape depending on where you have it planted. Whereas the yellow, whether you have it freestanding with nothing behind it or you've got it up against something to, you know, get that contrast, it is definitely the thing to brighten up your landscape fall, winter, and into early spring. So it is otherwise, you know, besides the color of the stems, grows pretty much just like the other ones. It's going to do well in sort of more wet soils, which is how they grow naturally. Now, I have had good success growing them in my very sandy soil. They're not going to grow as fast, which can be a good thing because some of these plants are quite vigorous. Now, Arctic Fire Yellow, only going to reach about 4 to 5 feet tall and about 6 feet wide, which is, you know, probably about 2/3 the size of your, you know, average one that before we introduced the Arctic Fire series, which of course is more dwarf. And of course, I'm glad because it is a native plant. You know, I love my native plants. The foliage supports all sorts of different larvae of caterpillars, all sorts of caterpillar larvae of butterflies and moths, and just generally looks great. If you let it flower, attracts a ton of pollinators. Now, a lot of people don't actually see their red twig dogwoods flower because they've pruned them. So most people don't even think about them as a flowering plant.
Right.
But you can prune them in such a way that they will actually still flower. Now, you were talking about the ones that you saw outside your mom's room. Now, the thing about red twig dogwood that a lot of people, and this is true of yellow twig dogwood, so Arctic Fire yellow as well, is that if you do not prune it, you will lose the color, because as those stems get more mature, they take on corky, more bark-like cells, and that completely obscures the color. So basically, you really don't want stems if you're growing it for color. Now, if you don't care about the color, let it do its thing. It'll be fine. The plant will be fine. We're talking about human desires here. You don't want any stems on it that are much more than 3 years old.
Yeah, so, I agree.
Yeah.
The plant responds incredibly to pruning. I think it's easy to grow, and you want to be pruning it because it just responds really well with beautiful, colorful branches.
And, you know, the nice thing about pruning it is that the prunings are actually useful because you can bring them inside and use them in holiday decor or use them outside. And that was something, you know, when I was a rooftop gardener, that we did on all of the properties that we took care of, is make arrangements of red and yellow twig dogwood, painted stems, birch stems, stuff like that, to just bring some interest to the landscape in the off season. So the nice thing is that, yes, you should keep your red twig or yellow twig dogwood 2-3-year-old and younger stems, but you can do that pruning now without harming the plant at all, and then take the stems that you're pruning out, use them, and then the plant is all the better for it. So it's kind of like a real win-win situation.
It's ideal for it, and ideal in Christmas containers. The plant itself is a very, very hardy plant.
Oh, yeah. Hardy from USDA Zone 2.
Zone 2.
That is very cold. That's much colder than we need anywhere in the continental U.S.
I'm glad I brought that up. Do I get a mini moto on the back? What was that?
A momiji.
A momiji on the back for that one.
No, I won't give you a momiji. But yeah, hardy to USDA Zone 2. So that's very, very cold tolerant. Now, as is often the case with very, very hardy plants, there is a trade-off on heat tolerance, and it's only heat tolerant through about USDA Zone 7. So anywhere much warmer than that, it's really going to struggle, unfortunately. But that still covers a really wide, you know, portion of the country. And, you know, you mentioned the hardiness and winter containers. That means this is one of those plants that if you were to go to your garden center and find some, and you just want to put the plant in your containers, it's going to survive just fine all through winter. And then come spring, you'll be able to take it out of that container, replace it with some daffodils, some fun spring stuff, and then go ahead and plant that in your garden. So it's a really versatile plant. And you know, you can cut so much off it.
Yeah. Stacey's talking about Arctic Fire yellow dogwood, and you can get the details at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. I think the perfect plant in the landscape. And by the way, Stacey, with this plant, love planting blue flowers in front of it.
Ooh.
Maybe a nepeta or something like that.
That's a nice idea, because you know, it would also be nice, Caryopteris.
Yeah,
because that's going to be blooming in fall when they're going to start taking on their color. It is deer resistant. Always good news for you and me, and I know a lot of our listeners as well. So good deer resistance on this plant. Like I said, it does prefer wetter soil, but you might find if you grow it in drier conditions like I do, it just stays more contained, lives just fine. But it's not going to get as big and vigorous, and it's not really going to sucker, because this is a plant that does sucker a bit. Now, I have found that it mostly stays within sort of the plant body. It's not suckering, 6 feet away from the main parent, but all the better, because if it does grow where you don't want it to grow, you just take out those stems and use them in your holiday decor.
And I don't consider it invasive that way.
No.
It's not invasive. As a matter of fact, what you can do is just accept compliments on its robust growth.
Yes, and its ability to withstand all these different conditions is why it is so ubiquitous in commercial landscapes, in residential landscapes. But it's really nice that it offers us this other thing, this homegrown, backyard decoration. So if you're not a vegetable gardener, you can still put something homegrown on your holiday table.
And it'll give you 4 seasons of interest. That
Hard to beat
color.
that.
Can't beat it.
So that's Arctic Fire Yellow Red Twig Dogwood. I know that sounds like a little bit of a contradiction of terms, but trust us, it's amazing. It's a beautiful plant, and you can find out more about it at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. We're going to take a little break. When we come back, we're opening up that garden mailbag, so please stay tuned. Greetings, gardening friends, and welcome back to the Gardening Simplified Show. Rick, you pulled something out on the break here.
Yeah.
And now we've got a rhododendron branch and a tulip bulb accompanying us in the studio here.
I cut this rhododendron branch from my neighbor's rhododendron before coming here, just joking, off the back of mine. If you have rhododendrons, just a public service note, and that is they should have big fat buds on them this time of the year. If they don't, you're doing something wrong, in my opinion.
Or the rhododendron is very unhappy, and you're going to need to take some steps to change that.
Exactly. And then tulip bulbs. This is what tulip bulbs should look like this time of the year. You should have roots begin growing out of the basal plate at the base. So you want roots starting to grow out of this tulip bulb. And that's the point. Plant them deep enough. You want to plant them deep enough in a well-drained soil so that prior to the ground freezing hard, they can develop these roots. Then in spring, when they start to grow,
they're good to go.
Your tulips will be good.
They got a little head start. And just a reminder, here we are. It is Thanksgiving week. It is not too late to plant bulbs.
Right.
So I find that Thanksgiving weekend is always the perfect time to plant any bulbs I have managed to accumulate over the previous weeks, whether I've picked them up on sale. Still plenty of time. So definitely, if you get the opportunity, you're out there putting up Christmas lights or whatever, don't forget you can still plant those bulbs. Well, as you know, one of the ways we try to simplify gardening for you here on the Gardening Simplified Show is by answering your garden questions. And you can reach us if you have a garden question at help, H-E-L-P, at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com, or just visit gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. There's a contact form there. And we have some interesting questions today.
Yeah, it's really good. Victoria writes to us, I recently discovered your show on YouTube, and I love it. Thank you very much, Victoria. I've been reading about jumping worms, and I'm really concerned. Would you talk about invasive species and how to deal with them? I'm new to gardening, and I really want to create a welcoming environment for wildlife, but it seems like an uphill battle. Jumping worms.
Yeah, jumping worms. So thank you so much for your question, Victoria. I want to say I can't talk about all invasive species in general. That's a lot. But I can speak to, of course, jumping worms, and I'll get to that. But I do want to talk about what you said about it seems like an uphill battle. And I get that. And, you know, I think that gardening can sometimes start to feel like, what's the point? What's the purpose? Why am I doing all of this? You know, everything feels very discouraging. But, you know, I think that for myself, one thing that has really helped to change that from it feeling like an uphill battle to feeling like an opportunity is to do a ton of research. And the more that I learn about where I garden, the plants that I garden with, the challenges that I face, it's like we talk about IPM, integrated pest management, a lot. By diving in and learning more about the problems, you're arming yourself for that battle, that uphill battle.
I agree. Research, but also make some mistakes.
Yeah.
That's how you learn. I've learned by making mistakes. And in this case with Victoria and these jumping worms, which we have heard about.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like ominous. I don't blame her for being worried or concerned. It's like, this is your final worming.
Yeah.
They're here, jumping worms.
And they sound really scary, jumping worms, but they don't jump out of the soil. They're not going to, like, you know, freak you out while you're out there having your morning coffee.
No, they inch their way in.
But I'm going to drop a little bomb on the audience here.
Uh-oh.
Because most people don't realize this, but in the northern part, basically north of Pennsylvania, of North America, we do not have any native earthworms. They were all destroyed by the last glacier about 10,000 years ago. That's what you call global
worming.
Global warming, yes.
Right?
Sorry. So 10,000 years ago, all of our native earthworms went extinct. And all of the earthworms that, you know, we've grown up seeing and learning about in our backyards, if you live basically, again, north of Pennsylvania, are invasive species that came in with, early settlers, colonists bringing in food. They came in on the ships, and it kind of turns this whole notion that, we've been hearing since we were kids about earthworms are so good, and the more earthworms in your soil, the better your soil is. When in fact, we are talking, whether it's a jumping worm or your night crawlers or whatever worm you are seeing in your backyard, those are actually introduced, and sometimes, as in the case of jumping worms, invasive species.
Post-glacier worms.
Yes.
Due to global warming. Okay, I got it.
So the glacier wiped them all out. They didn't come back. And now we have all of these invaders. So now to get to the jumping. So basically, in terms of the garden, in terms of residential environments, having earthworms is not really a problem. It's okay. They do, in fact, break stuff down in the soil and add more organic matter. They do have some benefit. But in the forest and in natural areas, it can be quite a different situation. They cycle through nutrients more quickly, so that can make it more difficult for certain native plants who have very close symbiotic relationships with the soil to thrive. It changes the soil chemistry. It changes the texture. It has caused problems for things like salamanders, one of my personal favorite creatures and something I always look forward to seeing in spring. Birds, it causes all sorts of problems. And so, again, we're looking at a difference between home and nature.
Interesting.
So it is important to understand what you're dealing with. And so we'll move on to the jumping worms, which, yes, are a problem in backyards, but are actually, unfortunately, found in natural areas as well. So they're a bit smaller than probably most of our worms that we commonly encounter when we're gardening. And they're called jumping worms because they move with like a really vigorous snake-like movement if they're disturbed. They're aggressive. They're aggressively wormy. And there's a couple of other characteristics that you can look for, and we'll post some links, of course, at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. But this is what I mean when I say you have to research and arm yourself with the knowledge of what you're facing, so that of course, if you're concerned, you've heard about jumping worms, then you need to look up pictures of them and know what to look for, so that if you do have them in your garden and you're out there next spring digging, then you know what you're dealing with. And that helps you feel more in control of the situation and, how you're resolving it.
Essentially, you have to be a bookworm.
You have to be
research.
An internet worm.
Yeah.
Good luck probably finding a lot of information about jumping worms in books these days. So it's a good idea to be able to recognize them so you can tell if they're a problem. And they are pretty much entrenched across the Midwest right now, as well as through the Northeast and Southeast as well. Now, if you know you have them, there aren't that many control methods. And that's what Victoria was asking, is like, how do I control these if they're in my yard? There aren't really very many things you can do. One thing you can do if you know that you have jumping worms is you can make a mixture of a gallon of water and 1/3 of a cup, which is a lot, of freshly ground mustard seed.
Oh.
And you can get mustard seed pretty inexpensively at a lot of like Indian groceries. So you don't have to go and get that little thing at, the grocery store that costs $7. You can get something less expensive. Grind that up, mix it together, pour that into the area, and you'll know you have jumping worms. It has like a coffee ground. They give your soil a coffee grounds like texture. That will cause them all to come to the surface. You can scrape them right up and toss them out. Now, you only want to do this, however, during the growing season. So basically like late spring through early fall, because jumping worm adults don't actually survive our winter. They're an annual worm.
Oh my, that's heartwarming. Right?
So the adults all die.
Yeah.
But they leave their cocoons in the soil, and then they hatch out in spring, and so it goes on. They actually do not have to mate to have cocoons of viable viable young worms.
That's just weird.
Yeah, it's not uncommon. Aphids do that as well. It's called parthenogenesis. Right. And I actually just read something that a fish in an aquarium just gave birth through parthenogenesis too. So it's a wild world out there. But the other thing that you should know, if you know that you have jumping worms, is do not give plants to your friends. And I know that's kind of a heartbreak. That's something that we gardeners love to do, is to share our plants. But any time of the year, you could have those cocoons in there. They're almost impossible to tell because they're soil colored. And so until the jumping worm issue is resolved, or you know that your friend also has jumping worms and you're not moving anything from one place to another, that would be another recommendation I would have for if you have jumping worms.
Wow. Do the birds like them? I'm going to hope that the birds like them. I mean, this time of the year, I'll till leaves into the soil, and then next spring, there's all kinds of earthworms in there. I just love it. I think it's great for my soil. But the birds love the worms, too. I mean, I'm going to assume they'd eat jumping worms, too.
I'm sure they would eat jumping worms if they can get them. But, they probably are going to go burrow down into the soil and not be, on top, unless it's one of those after a rain situation when all the worms come out. So that's probably more than any of you wanted to hear about jumping worms, but I thought it was actually quite interesting. If you want more resources or all the information that I just shared, Gardening Simplified onair.com. Now we have to take a little break. When we come back, we've got a special guest for Branching News. You aren't going to want to miss that, so stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Gardening Simplified Show. It's time for branching news. No, it's not breaking news, but we don't make this stuff up. And today, I'm excited. We get an opportunity to talk to Lisa Rose. Lisa is an herbalist, a forager, an urban farmer, a writer with a background in anthropology, and a professional focus on community health. She's gathered her food, farming, and wild plant knowledge from many people and many different places all across the world. I guess you could call it a delicious journey. Lisa's written 3 books. I have read some of them. One of them, Midwest Foraging. Another one, Midwest Medicinal Plants. And now, Urban Foraging, which, Stacey, I'm very interested in getting into because having spent time in places like New York City or whatever, I'm not quite sure how you're going to forage for food, but I guess Lisa is going to let us know. Lisa, welcome to the Gardening Simplified Show.
Rick, it is so lovely to be reunited. Excited to be here.
I have known Lisa for a number of years. She was on a previous program with me, Stacey, and I remember one time I caught a cold, and Lisa talked me out of Vicks Vapo Rub. She just told me how to get some needles off a pine tree and steam or boil them, and I tried it, and it worked, and it cleared my sinuses, and I was like hooked on this whole foraging thing, Lisa.
Plants, as we know, are magical. They have a whole variety of values they bring to the world, not just for our ecosystems, but for health and for beauty. So I'm lucky to have helped you a little bit with the cold, and from there, our friendship had blossomed, I guess you could say.
You got it. Now, teach me, ethnobotany. What is ethnobotany?
It's a really fancy academic word for simply the study of how humans have used and worked with plants across time and across states. And so for me, my love of plants came, when I was very young, being out in the garden with my mom. We're from Flint originally, moved over to the west side of the state. Was lucky enough to be, just a stone's throw from Lake Michigan. And so, plants have and just the natural world has always been a strong part of my life. And from that point of curiosity, I've always been interested in how people across the world have related to the natural spaces around them, the botany, the plants around them for food and medicine. So not just current day people like me and you, but also past cultures and past histories and our past as a species for thousands of years. So that's my jam.
Well, Lisa, so ethnobotany is essentially the relationship or the interrelations between people and plants, which is something we talk about often here on the Gardening Simplified Show.
At the core of it, that really is what it is. And I think that I'm never without a day that I don't find and learn something new about a different way somebody relates to plants, a different way a culture uses plants and works with plants or even understands plants. So that's, like I said, it's the center of my work and yours as well.
So in your most recent book, Urban Foraging, you teach us that for city dwellers, finding ingredients for dinner may be as easy as stepping outside into the greenway. Give us some examples on that. How do I do that in New York City or Lincoln, Nebraska or Los Angeles? How do we do that?
Yeah, well, urban foraging really is the next step and continuation of the work that you've known me to be, to teach and to bring, to communities and to people that you step outside and you are in nature. Nature is all around us. You don't have to go to a national park or to, an exotic locale to make that immediate connection with nature. And so urban foraging really is is twofold: to help bring and inspire people outside of their urban scape. If you are in New York City, for the past couple of years, my office has been in New York City, so I was co-located and getting outside with my neighborhood around my office and connecting people with plants in their area, and to just say, look, just open your eyes and start to understand that nature is around us. Now, there's a second half to that. It's understanding plant ecosystems, watersheds, contamination that we frequently have in our cities. So that's the other half of how do we understand the current state of our landscape? How can we really take steps to bring health back into our cityscapes? And so it's this real treatise, I think, in my own way, to inspire people to make that connection, that plants are outside your doorstep, outside towards Central Park. Can Central Park be your green grocer? Can you be gathering everything for a meal? Not only is that not, feasible from a plant community perspective, it would be unethical, right? Just from a volume perspective. So it's more of a jumping off place to say, hey, we are connected to nature. And in our cities, especially where there's some of the most, I want to say the word, degraded lands, abused lands, and certainly urban communities that we feel left behind in our Rust Belt communities. It's really also a story of hope that we can reconnect to the land that's outside our door and reconnect to the source of our health and really have that be a hope and a way forward.
Stacey, you lived for some time in New York City. Did it cross your mind to go out there and do some urban foraging?
I mean, I didn't, but I definitely, as someone who loves and, has some understanding of plants, there were certainly times where I would walk by and something and just say, oh, you know what, I bet people don't realize that's edible. Or, there's so many things that people just think of as weeds that are actually pretty choice edibles. And it doesn't have to be as urban as New York City. Certainly here in West Michigan, we have a lot of those that we could get. And, one of the things I'm really interested in, Lisa, is how urban foraging can help to, in some small way, mitigate the spread of invasive plants, because so much of it is things like harvesting fruit from Elaeagnus that helps to prevent the spread.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a reframe. So one, I'm glad that you can make that connection, having, as a New York City dweller, to be able to see the potential, and that that those edible plants and those plant allies are around us in the city. I think when we look at, I think what it gives us a jumping off place to have a conversation of what is a healthy ecosystem. Mm. Right? It's bigger than invasive species. It says, okay, what do we really need here to have a system that has a healthy watershed, a healthy, how do we look at the built environment in general? What are we, I think, and that's at the planning level perhaps, but then as a community gardener, right? What can I do outside my windowsill to attract pollinators, to plant container gardens? If I have a community garden space, just down the street or within my block and my neighborhood association, how can we consider, working with the wild plants, and then also maybe take it one step further to add, I think of it as how do we add versus combat, right? Because when we add and have this regenerative, generative approach to design, it has, I feel, a compounding effect in terms of, how do we add fruit trees into the space, or how do we consider, looking at the land, where do we have invasive plants? What have we planted previously that might not be suited for, in terms of the soil, or if it's, if we talk about autumn olive that you mentioned, how do we eat the fruit, or recognize that is a way of managing our plant community, right? So I think it's again that it's sprouts a conversation to say, okay, how do we really look deeply at what a healthy ecosystem can be, and then add those things in, right? And then that will just start like a healthy compost pile that requires the layers and the integration and the turning and getting things to the right temperature. We've all heard of slow food. In my world, it's like I start to think of it then as slow gardening, right? How do we start to really slow things down and start to understand by first paying attention, right? Because that's one of our biggest abilities as gardeners, to pay attention. Naturalists, we read the landscape. How do we start to get outside? Again, before you gather anything and put it in your mouth, you need to know what it is, right?
Oh, absolutely.
A very important part of the process.
Okay. All right. So this is not just a philosophical, discussion. This is really also brass tacks and quite practical. You get outside your front door, you need to know where you are. You need to be able to understand, what the basics of botany, and then also not to like we started with the word ethnobotany. I really feel that foraging and community gardening democratizes plant knowledge, right? This is not just a way. This is a way humans have lived as long as we've been on the planet, right?
That's a great point. It really is. And Lisa, following you through the years, and again, we're talking to Lisa Rose, two beautiful books that I have read, Midwest Foraging and Midwest Medicinal Plants. Now Lisa's new book, Urban Foraging. And Lisa, along the lines of where you were going with that, I have found from following you, reading your books, that many of these plants that we're foraging for in society, we consider to be weeds. It's like, take me to your weeder, dandelions, right? Or one that totally gets me that I cannot handle is nettles.
Oh, we can't handle it. I got you there. I saw where you were going.
I mean, are these stinging nettles, Lisa? And we're going to consume them?
And I think that you hit on it. It's like these are the great secrets of health hiding in plain sight, right? And not only hiding in plain sight, but they've been, they're the dastardly demons in our gardens, when in actuality, they each play roles in the soil, right? There's a reason they're there, good, bad, or otherwise, right? And then also they have tremendous health benefits. And, you mentioned the stinging nettles, very high in plant protein. Everybody knows nettles, especially if your kid brother or sister pushed you off your bike into the ditch.
Yes.
Along the roadside, right? I know. You've fallen in them and you've gotten poked, and they're distributed on different species across all of the North America, United States, and into Europe. But historically, nettles have been used as a cordage to make rope, to make thread, and it's highly nutritious, high in plant proteins, high in magnesium, high in calcium, it really puts spinach to shame if you start to look at the nutritional value side by side. And so, again, though, we talked at the beginning, to understand the landscape, you need to gather nettles from a place that has a clean water source. Generally, you'll find them in a drainage ditch area, or, alongside a creek or a stream bed. But you really need to have that base knowledge to say, okay, what's the water source? Can I harvest these nettles, and how to make those really good decisions that once upon a time used to be, how we fed our families during the Second War. Nettles, huge staple in France and into Italy and Germany, when people had nothing else to eat because of food shortages, right? So these are really, it seems trendy and kind of new and even new age in some ways when you talk about herbal medicine. But again, the ethnobotanist in me says, look, these plants have had a history of use with humans, a relationship with humans across time and across space. How can we refine those traditions and bring them into our lives? And honestly, it's not just about the plate of salad that you might get, from gathering your dandelions or violets, but you get, I think, with a more deep emotional connection to nourishing yourself. And again, just that pride, when you watch kids pick tomatoes off of a, tomato vine that they've grown in their own garden. The same happens, when you watch kids pick dandelion leaves and dress their salads with, dandelion flowers and violet flowers, or steam nettles, or have fun banging each other up with nettle branches in the field. I guess, right? I've watched it with my kids, with kids in the school gardens and whatnot. It just, there's something about it too that reminds us how to be playful, right? Getting outside. In our first segment, Lisa, we did talk about vegetables, and we talked about the bitter nature of some vegetables and why many kids have difficulty eating vegetables. Cake, ice cream, that type of thing are synonymous with good times and parties and that sort of thing. But how do we get them to eat their vegetables? And of course, part of it, is education, and looking at something in a different light. Yeah, and I love that you bring that up, because it is about exposure. Our standard American diet has two flavors. You mentioned one, which is sweet, and the other is salty. Now, I love a glazed donut like the next girl. Okay, and I love, my salt and vinegar potato chips. Oh, yeah. But I also know that my body knows, because I can recognize this, because I know when I need to have my bitter salad greens, my endive, my radicchio, right? My dandelion leaves. In some cases, I need to add, some dock, some medicinal bitter greens to my diet if my stomach's upset. And I think that our bodies know how to use all 5 flavors. It's just a matter of having exposure and then integrating that into our day-to-day diet. And we've come so far from that, using those wild plants and having such over-processed sweet and salty food, that we just don't know how to go forward, right, with those new flavors.
Well, speaking of going forward, so what is your advice, aside obviously from getting your book, for someone who wants to start getting into foraging, and understanding that first step, identifying what you are seeing is the hardest in many ways to start to acquire, that breadth of knowledge. What's your advice for someone to kind of get, their first foray into foraging?
So for anybody interested in starting out as a beginner, all of my books, all my foraging field guides really provide a methodology and a framework to thinking about how to begin foraging, right, in a very easy and accessible way. First and foremost, I always love people to start with stepping outside their front door and really just take a walk, choose a path forward. Perhaps it's around the block. Perhaps it's down the street and back. Perhaps it's to your children's school. If you drop kids off at school, maybe you walk around the schoolyard, and start and bring along a paper and pen and start to notice what the landscape is. If you're a gardener, you're actually even one step ahead, because you already have a space that grows plants that invariably may already have wild plants in them that we might qualify as weeds, right? So there's this noticing practice that is first and foremost important to start to practice and to adopt as a forager. Of course, as a gardener, the importance of also noticing seasonal patterns, right? And changes in the landscape across the year. So having this new way of looking at the world, you'll start to observe and notice what grows when. If you start to take the same route over and over again as a very, I think of a farmer who walks their field every day, right? They know every inch of that land inside and out, forward, backward, and from winter until the next winter, right? So just to start this as a practice to get to know the land that you're at. And one of those considerations then also is to understand, okay, how has this land been used over time? So something I've talked about is safety, right? Getting to know the historical use of land is quite important, regardless of rural, suburban, or urban landscapes, right? There are things to be careful of, everything from railroad tracks to easements to Superfund sites, gas stations, right? Just all, again, being a girl from Flint, these are things that are in my awareness all the time. And it doesn't mean that you can't. Go ahead.
And you practice what you preach, Lisa, because Stacey, Lisa, and I met a number of years ago as runners. Oh. And I would observe in races that she was more interested in veering off into the brush because she spotted something. Yeah. Then and eventually you'd get to the finish line. So you even did foraging while we were out there running.
Yep, admittedly, I have been told I'd be much faster if I didn't snack and forage along the way. But, I am just somebody that's quite practical. And if I'm going to go out for 20 miles, I may as well put acorns in my pocket. Sometimes my running bra, I snack on crab apples. Again, you gotta use your resources strategically, right? And, I think that, again, though, being mindful of where to gather is really, again, that crucial step, right? And it then comes down to logic and common sense. Once you start to know your plants, if they're crab apples in the city or, off, for those that are familiar with Grand Rapids, let's say, off of the trails over in some of the more industrial areas, I'll say, let's say Chicago Drive. If I came across an old wild apple tree, I most likely would snack on it. I'm not saying anybody else, if they're not comfortable with that, should. But if it was a root, maybe like the yellow dock in that same, let's say same blighted field out on Chicago Drive, or nettles, I might choose to not harvest there if I didn't need to, or snack, from plants in that same blighted field, because I understand, if a plant takes up minerals and we eat it for its minerals, like let's say spinach, nettles, those same plants will have a high uptake of things like lead. They'll have a high uptake of things like the arsenic. So that's a little different from the fruit parts of a tree, right? So these are you start to become aware and think about those plant parts that are edible. Of course, my biggest rule is don't put anything in your mouth that you don't know what it is, right?
That's what we teach kids.
It doesn't always work. Adults that too, and it doesn't always work.
Exactly.
So go ahead.
We're talking to Lisa Rose. Again, 3 beautiful books: Midwest Foraging, Midwest Medicinal Plants, and now Urban Foraging. Lisa, we have just a moment left here. I wanted to ask you, for our listeners and our viewers, with Urban Foraging, can you give us 3 plants in the city that maybe are tops on the list for you? And one of them cannot be nettles or dandelions. So top 3 in urban foraging.
Okay, top 3 in urban foraging. That's easy, but difficult. So the first one is going to be mulberry. Mm. So across North America, the mulberry, which is not native to the United States or to North America, is all over our urban scapes, and the fruit is amazing in June. It's one of my favorite first early summer berries to harvest. I make jam, I make pies, love the mulberries. Super easy to identify once you can identify it. Sure. It's not confusable with, a later berry like poke or buckthorn berries, right? So mulberry is one of my fave.
What's number two, Lisa?
Ginkgo. Ginkgo.
Oh, really?
Is one of my, yes. Ginkgo has been commonly used. Well, it's for urban environments, very tolerant of growing conditions. It grows and has been planted by landscape architects all over many cities. Sure. And not only can the fruits be used, the nuts of the fruits when they're available, but also the leaves. for teas. And right now, in late fall, is a wonderful time to gather the leaves of the ginkgo.
Gorgeous.
And then my third one is acorns from the oak tree. And, we've got a lot of disease threatening our oak trees across North America. The acorns have provided humans nutritious plant carbohydrates for thousands of years. It's one of I like to call it a gateway foraging herb. When you come to my house and it's a football game on, I'll set a bowl of acorns down. You'll probably be asked to help shell the acorns while I maybe make up a foraged cocktail for game day. And by far, the oak tree is near and dear to me, is one of my favorite trees and provider of food in our landscape.
I got to ask you real quickly, foraged cocktail?
Oh, yes. And if you don't know my ability to forage plants for cocktails, we might want to come back for a new episode.
Let's do that.
Oh, I love it.
Let's do that. I want to hear about these foraged cocktails. Her name is Lisa Rose. 3 beautiful books, Midwest Foraging, Midwest Medicinal Plants, and now Urban Foraging. Lisa, it's always a treat to talk to you, and all the best. And yeah, I'd like to take you up on that. Let's talk about cocktail foraging sometime.
Foraging in person, because it's been way too long, Mr. Vuyst. So I look forward to seeing you soon.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you both. I appreciate you and your love for plants.
Well, I don't know if there's a much better way to spend the next couple months of the off season than learning about foraging. So when everything starts growing again, you're ready to go. So that's what I'm going to do. And we thank you for listening. Thank you, Rick. Thanks, Adriana. Of course, thanks to our guest, Lisa. And thank you all for listening. We hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving and a wonderful week ahead.